She looked at me like she already knew the parts of me I hadn't admitted to myself, then smiled and said, "You're not as innocent as you look." And in that moment, nothing about my life stayed the same. It was supposed to be just another ordinary morning, one of those predictable days where nothing really stands out and everything blends into routine. The kind of day you forget as soon as it ends. I remember the soft hum of the place, the faint sound of papers turning, low conversations drifting in and out like background noise. Everything felt controlled, almost too calm. I was focused on my own task, trying to stay in my lane, keeping my attention on details that didn't require emotion. That's when she arrived. There was no dramatic entrance, no sudden silence or attention drawn by noise. And yet, somehow, everything shifted anyway. She walked in with a quiet confidence that didn't ask for space. It simply took it. Mid-40s, composed, elegant in a way that didn't feel forced. Her presence was refined, not loud or attention-seeking, but impossible to ignore once noticed. She carried herself like someone who had already seen enough of life to no longer rush through it. Her eyes moved across the room briefly, observant, calculating in a soft way, like she wasn't just seeing people, but understanding them. When her gaze landed on me, it didn't pass over quickly like most do. It paused, just a fraction longer than normal. Long enough for me to notice it, and long enough for me to feel it. I didn't look away immediately. Something in her expression made that difficult. Not intimidation, something quieter. Awareness, like she had already formed an opinion about me without a single word exchanged. Then happened, a small smirk, barely there, but unmistakable. Not mocking, not kind either, more like amused understanding, as if she had read something in me I hadn't even shown. And just like that, I became aware of myself in a completely different way. The way I stood, the way I held my expression, even the way I was breathing suddenly felt noticeable. She didn't approach right away. Instead, she spoke to someone nearby, completely composed, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't unsee that moment. It stayed with me, looping quietly in my mind. A few minutes later, our paths crossed naturally. It wasn't planned, just circumstance. A shared space, a shared task, something small that required coordination. "Are you new here?" she asked, her voice calm, steady, almost effortless. I nodded, trying to sound normal. "Yeah, recently joined." She tilted her head slightly, studying me again, but this time closer. Not intrusive, just observant. Like she was connecting dots I didn't know existed. She murmured softly, almost to herself. That small sound carried more weight than it should have. There was a pause. Not awkward, but loaded with something unspoken. I could feel it, the subtle imbalance in the interaction. Like she was slightly ahead of me in a conversation I hadn't even started understanding yet. Then she turned slightly, about to leave, but stopped just long enough to glance back at me once more. And that same faint smirk returned. Not louder than before. Not different. Just deeper. As if she already knew this wasn't going to stay as ordinary as it looked. After that first encounter, I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. People pass through each other all the time. A glance, a brief interaction, a strange expression you interpret too deeply, and then life moves on. That's what I told myself. But somehow, she didn't feel like someone who simply passed through. The next time we ended up in the same space, it wasn't dramatic. In fact, it was frustratingly normal. A shared task, something simple enough that it shouldn't have required much discussion. But she was there again, calm, composed, already comfortable in a space that still felt slightly unfamiliar to me. "Can you show me how you organize this?" she asked, her tone polite but direct. I nodded, explaining it carefully, trying to keep everything professional. I noticed how she listened, not in a passive way, but with intent. Her eyes didn't wander. They stayed on me, following not just my words, but my reactions as I spoke. That was the first strange thing. I started speaking more carefully without realizing it. Not because I was nervous exactly, but because she made me feel like every detail mattered. When I finished explaining, she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned slightly closer to look at the material in front of us. It wasn't an obvious movement, but enough to shift the space between us. I became aware of things I shouldn't have been thinking about. The soft sound of her movement, the faint scent that followed her, something warm and subtle, and the way her presence seemed to fill the small gap between silence and speech. "You're very precise," she said suddenly. I looked at her. "Is that a good thing?" Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, not quite teasing. "That depends," she replied. "Sometimes precision is confidence. Sometimes it's control." That line stayed with me longer than I expected. There was a pause again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt layered, like something was happening underneath the surface of a very normal conversation. She straightened slightly, crossing her arms loosely, studying me again, but differently now. Not like a stranger, not even like a colleague. More like someone trying to understand a pattern. "You don't talk like most people your age," she said after a moment. I frowned slightly. Is that supposed to be a compliment or criticism? She gave a small, effortless shrug. Neither. Just observation. But her eyes said she enjoyed saying it. That was the strange part. She never pushed too far, but she never stayed completely neutral either. Every comment felt balanced on the edge of something unspoken. At one point, while I was pointing something out on a document, she stepped slightly closer again. Her hand came near mine. Not touching fully, but close enough that I felt the intention behind the movement. She adjusted a detail I had missed. "Here," she said softly, her voice lower now. For a brief second, her fingers brushed the edge of the paper near mine. It was nothing significant on the surface, just a correction, just work, but my mind registered it differently than it should have. She noticed my pause. Of course she did. A faint, knowing smile returned. Not the smurf from before, but something subtler. "Relax," she said quietly. "I'm not analyzing you that deeply." But the way she said it made me feel like she absolutely was. And somehow, neither of us ended the conversation quickly after that. It stretched, longer than it needed to, not because of the task, but because neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave it. By the time we met again, something had already shifted between us, though neither of us would have said it out loud. It wasn't visible in an obvious way. There were no dramatic confessions, no clear changes in behavior. But conversations had started to feel heavier, pauses a little longer, and glances a little more intentional. She acted the same, as always, composed, confident, slightly distant in a way that made her even harder to read. But now I noticed things I had missed before. The way she observed before speaking. The way she seemed to enjoy silence just as much as conversation. The way she never rushed anything, as if time worked differently around her. This time, the interaction began like the others, casual, simple, almost routine. A small task that required coordination. But within minutes, the tone shifted again without either of us deciding it should. "You always think before you speak," she said suddenly, while I was explaining something. I paused. "Is that unusual?" She tilted her head slightly, studying me like she was deciding how honest to be. "For most people," she said calmly, "yes. They speak to fill silence. You speak like silence matters." The words lingered in the air longer than expected. There was a quiet stretch after that. Not uncomfortable, just dense with unspoken awareness. I looked down at what I was doing, trying to stay focused, but I could feel her watching me still. Not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that made me aware of myself again. Then she moved, not suddenly, not dramatically, just a small step closer. She reached forward to adjust something near my shoulder, some detail that needed correction, something professional on the surface. But her hand didn't leave immediately after fixing it. Instead, it lingered for a fraction longer than necessary. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it completely. Her fingers brushed lightly against the fabric near my collar, precise and controlled, like she was correcting a detail rather than crossing a boundary. But the effect wasn't neutral. It wasn't supposed to be, and she knew I had felt it. I could tell by the way she didn't pull away too quickly. Instead, she stayed close for another moment, her presence quietly surrounding the space between us. I became aware of everything at once. The distance that had disappeared, the sound of her breathing slightly closer than before, and the strange stillness that followed such a small gesture. "You get distracted easily," she said softly, as if nothing unusual had happened. I looked at her. "I'm not distracted." That made her smile just slightly. She murmured. "That's what I mean." Her tone wasn't teasing in a loud way. It was quieter, more knowing. Like she wasn't calling me out, but observing a truth I hadn't admitted yet. For a moment, neither of us moved away. The space between us felt carefully balanced, close enough to feel present, distant enough to pretend nothing was happening. Then she leaned back just enough to break the intensity, crossing her arms again like she had simply adjusted a detail and nothing more. But the shift had already happened, because now there was something unspoken between us that didn't exist before that moment. Something she had crossed without touching too much, but impossible for me to ignore. It happened later in the evening, when the day had already started to lose its structure. The lights in the space had softened, conversations had thinned out, and everything felt quieter in a way that made emotions easier to notice. It was the kind of stillness where even small gestures feel louder than they should. We were alone in the same area again. Not intentionally, just the result of timing and unfinished work. But this time, something felt different. Less like coincidence, more like continuation. She stood near the window for a moment, looking outside as if she was thinking about something far away. I remember noticing how calm she looked when she wasn't speaking. Completely in control, yet slightly distant, like her thoughts were somewhere I couldn't access. When she turned back toward me, her expression had changed subtly. Not colder, sharper. "You think too much," she said suddenly. I frowned slightly. "That's not always a bad thing. It is when you think you're hiding it well," she replied. That made me pause. There was no teasing in her voice this time. Just observation, direct, steady, almost uncomfortably accurate. I felt like she was looking past the surface of what I was saying and into something I hadn't fully shaped myself. I tried to respond lightly, but she didn't let the moment become casual again. Instead, she took a slow step closer. Not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. And suddenly, the space between us felt smaller than it should have. Her gaze stayed on me, unwavering, calm in a way that made me more aware of my own reaction than anything else. I couldn't tell what she was expecting, but I could feel that she was waiting, not for an answer, but for a response that wasn't rehearsed. Then she said it, softly, almost like she was sharing a private thought instead of a statement meant to be heard. "You're not as innocent as you look." The words didn't feel like an accusation. They felt like recognition. For a moment, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't understand, but because I did. And that understanding created a strange silence between us that neither of us rushed to break. Her expression didn't change immediately. She just watched me, as if measuring how deeply the words landed. I finally let out a small breath, trying to steady the moment. "What makes you say that?" A faint smirk returned to her lips, but softer now, almost thoughtful instead of teasing. "You hesitate," she said simply. "People who are innocent don't hesitate the way you do. They react. You observe first." The way she said it wasn't harsh. It was calm, almost gentle in its certainty. I didn't know how to respond to that, because she wasn't entirely wrong. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Heavier, more aware. It wasn't just conversation anymore. It was perception. Two people quietly realizing they were seeing more of each other than intended. At one point, she looked away briefly, as if deciding whether to continue the moment or leave it there. But she didn't leave. Instead, she exhaled lightly and stepped back just enough to restore distance, crossing her arms again, as if to reset the atmosphere. Yet the shift had already happened, because now her words stayed in the air between us, echoing in a way neither of us addressed again that night. And I realized something quietly unsettling. She wasn't just talking to me. She was studying me. After that night, nothing between us changed in an obvious way, but everything felt different. The strange part was how normal everything looked from the outside. Conversations still happened. Tasks were still completed. We still exchanged polite words when needed, still acknowledged each other like nothing unusual had ever passed between us. But inside that normality, something had shifted position. She became slightly more controlled around me. Not distant in a cold way, but careful, as if she had decided to place a boundary where none had clearly existed before. Her tone remained calm, her expressions composed, but the small layers of playfulness that once slipped into her voice were now restrained. And I noticed it immediately, the absence of it. At first, I told myself it was better this way, that maybe I had been reading too much into moments that meant nothing beyond coincidence. But the mind doesn't easily forget emotional weight once it has registered it. So I started noticing her more instead. The way she avoided unnecessary eye contact that used to last a second too long. The way she no longer leaned in slightly when speaking. The way her voice stayed consistently professional, even in casual exchanges. It wasn't rejection, it was control. And somehow, that made it harder to ignore. One afternoon, I caught her glancing at me briefly while speaking to someone else. It lasted only a moment, so quick that anyone else would have missed it. But I didn't. And the strange part was, she looked away almost immediately after noticing I had seen it. Like she had allowed herself a mistake and corrected it instantly. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected, because it didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like restraint. Our conversations became shorter after that, more structured, less space for anything unplanned to enter. Even when we worked together, there was a noticeable shift in rhythm, like two people carefully stepping around something neither of them wanted to acknowledge out loud. And yet, the silence between words became louder. At times, I would catch myself waiting for her usual subtle remarks, the quiet observations that used to slip between professional lines. But they didn't come anymore. Instead, there was only efficiency, politeness, distance disguised as normalcy. But distance doesn't erase memory. There were moments when I would look up and find her already looking away, as if she had been watching for longer than she intended to admit. And in those split seconds, I would see something flicker in her expression, something unspoken, quickly buried beneath composure. Neither of us ever commented on it. That was the unspoken agreement, to continue as if nothing had changed, while both of us clearly felt that something had. One evening, as the day was ending and people were slowly leaving, I noticed her standing alone for a moment. Not busy, not speaking, just still. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. For a second, I almost walked toward her, but I didn't, and she didn't look at me either. Instead, she adjusted her posture, composed herself again, and returned to her usual presence, as if that brief moment of stillness had never existed. But I had seen it, and so had she. That was the real distance between us now. Not space, not silence, but the shared awareness of something we were both refusing to name. And, somehow, that made everything feel even closer than before. It didn't happen in a perfect moment. It happened in a real one, messy, unplanned, and far from anything either of us could control. The day had been heavier than usual, not because of anything dramatic at first, but because small pressures kept stacking. Unfinished work, shifting responsibilities, people asking for decisions that required more energy than expected. The atmosphere felt tight, like everyone was holding something in without saying it out loud. She was there, of course, always composed on the surface, always appearing like nothing could disturb her balance. But I started noticing small cracks, not visible to others, but clear to someone who had been paying attention long enough. A slower response than usual, a brief pause before speaking, a moment where her eyes didn't immediately focus on the next task. Then came the turning point. Something went wrong, nothing catastrophic, but enough to disrupt the flow of the day. A mistake, a miscommunication, a pressure point that needed immediate correction. People started talking at once, voices overlapping, tension rising in a way that made the room feel smaller. And for the first time, I saw her lose her rhythm. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Her voice came through the noise, controlled at first, trying to restore order. But there was a subtle edge to it now. Not anger exactly, but strain. The kind that appears when someone has been holding everything together for too long without showing it. I said that wasn't finalized, she repeated, her tone sharper than before. The room quieted slightly. She wasn't loud, but she didn't need to be. For a moment, everything seemed under control again. But then I saw it just briefly. The way her hand tightened slightly at her side. The way she exhaled a little slower than usual. The way her composure wasn't breaking, but bending. And without thinking too much about it, I stepped closer. Not to interrupt. Not to fix anything. Just to be there. When the situation eased slightly and people began to move away, she remained where she was, still holding herself upright, still maintaining presence. But now there was something different in her stillness. Less authority, more fatigue. She turned slightly, catching my presence beside her. For a second, she didn't speak. Then she looked away, as if deciding whether to keep everything contained or let even a fraction of it show. "You shouldn't get involved in this," she said quietly. Her voice was lower now. Not sharp, not distant, just tired. I didn't respond immediately, because I could see it now more clearly than before. Not the version of her everyone else saw, but the human weight underneath it. The effort it took to stay composed. The space she never allowed anyone to see. Without planning it, I spoke softly. "You don't always have to carry it alone." That made her pause. Not visibly dramatic, but enough for me to notice. For the first time in all our interactions, she didn't have an immediate response ready. She looked at me, not studying, not analyzing, but simply acknowledging. And in that pause, something shifted. She let out a quiet breath, almost like she was releasing something she had been holding in without realizing. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but it didn't sound convincing anymore. A silence followed, not uncomfortable, but fragile. The kind that forms when control is no longer fully intact, and neither person knows what will come if it continues. Then, unexpectedly, she leaned slightly, not fully collapsing into me, just enough. Her shoulder lightly touched mine for balance. Subtle, unplanned, almost instinctive. And I didn't move away. Instead, I raised my hand slightly, steadying her arm gently, without pressure. It was the first time there was no distance between us, not emotional strategy, not awareness, not hesitation. Just human presence. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. And in that silence, something unspoken finally stopped pretending to be in control. The next few days didn't bring any dramatic change. There was no sudden confession, no emotional explosion, no moment where everything was neatly explained and tied together. Instead, there was something quieter, more real, a kind of understanding that didn't need to be spoken because it had already been felt too deeply to be ignored. When I saw her again after everything, she looked like herself again, composed, elegant, in control. But now I could see the difference, not in how she appeared to others, but in how I saw her. There was a softness behind her composure that hadn't been visible before, like something in her no longer needed to be defended so tightly. Our interaction began like it always did, simple, polite, careful, but the space between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt acknowledged. For a moment, neither of us rushed to fill silence. And strangely, it didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt settled. "You recovered quickly," I said lightly at one point, referring indirectly to what had happened before. She gave a small, knowing look, not defensive, not distant. "I had to," she replied calmly. But this time, there was no barrier behind her words. We both understood what she meant. The conversation drifted naturally after that. Small topics, simple updates, nothing heavy on the surface. But beneath it, there was a quiet awareness that something had already changed permanently. At one point, she paused while speaking, her gaze briefly shifting toward me. Not the sharp observational look from before. Not the teasing smirk. Just a calm, steady glance that held more honesty than words usually allowed. "You think too much," she said again, but this time it sounded different. Less like a judgment, more like familiarity. I smiled slightly. "You've said that before." "I know," she replied softly. "And you still do." There was a short silence after that, but it wasn't empty. It felt like space, safe, unforced. For the first time, there was no need to interpret every pause or analyze every expression. Everything that needed to be understood had already been communicated in the moments we had shared before. Not everything between us had become clear, but it had become accepted. As the day neared its end, people began to leave, conversations fading into background noise. She remained for a little while longer, gathering her things slowly, without urgency. I stood nearby, not interrupting, simply present. At one point, she stopped for a second, as if deciding whether to say something. Then she turned slightly toward me. Her expression was calm, no teasing, no distance, just honesty softened by time. "It's rare," she said quietly, "to meet someone who notices things without trying to change them." I didn't respond immediately, because I understood what she meant, but more importantly, I understood what she wasn't saying. That brief pause between us held everything we had avoided naming for so long. Finally, I nodded slightly, and it's rare to meet someone who lets themselves be seen without disappearing. That made her look at me a little longer than usual. Not surprised, just present. Then she gave a small, genuine smile. Not the smirk from the beginning, not the controlled expression from before. Something softer, something real. Without turning it into something bigger than it was, she adjusted her bag, took a calm breath, and stepped back into her usual composure. But this time, it didn't feel like distance. It felt like completion. As she left, there was no dramatic farewell. No antisaltención. Just a quiet understanding that what had happened between us didn't need to be defined to be real. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was trying to understand her anymore. I just understood her.